What did you have for breakfast today?
I had a coffee for breakfast.
That's it?
And then I had some, what did I eat? I think I had a salmon sushi roll and an avocado roll.
Delish. Welcome to Uncommon, the podcast that helps you build your knowledge, skills, and mindset through interviews with unique individuals. My name is Jordan Michaelides, and I'm your host. To learn more about our array of guests, just head to neuralle.com/podcast. In this episode, I have for you Shayne Hunter. Shayne is a comedian and ex-leader of radical left-wing group Antifa in Australia. He's probably one of the most intelligent and intense comedians I've ever come across. He's floated in and out of ideology over the last few years, initially a right-wing libertarian, then an anarchist or leftist radical, and now a steadfast libertarian pushing people to not fall into the ideology of identity politics. Shayne is socially aware and poignant in his analysis of society, a benefit to anyone wanting to learn more about groupthink. This episode is a brilliant lesson in how people can just get sucked into cabbaging their minds about belief and ideology and cults. Most of my time was spent getting out of Shayne's way, letting him explain his journey and the ideology of the radical left, the group which he believes is ideologically more dangerous than ISIS. In terms of key topics we covered, we spoke first about cognitive biases and how the education system could be improved for that, conspiracy theories, procrastination. We then got into Antifa, what it is, his involvement, their ideologies, things like critical theory, postmodernism, neo-Marxism. We then got into comparing the radical left to the radical right, the outrage industrial complex, advice for ideologues, and Jordan Peterson to finish off. I think this is a fascinating episode and really would be enjoyable for anyone. Particularly if you like radicalism, ideology, and politics. If you enjoyed this episode, I suggest you go check out my chat with Neil Kolhatkar. That was episode 27. We spoke about politics, satire, and comedy. Neil was actually the one that introduced Shayne and I thank him for that. As well, Edward Burke, who is more on the right wing of politics. I wouldn't say he's an identitarian, but again, it sort of covers conservatism, Trump, and so forth, and that was episode 24. So if you want those show notes, just head to our index at neuralle.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe on your app, or perhaps consider sharing with one of your friends who may enjoy this sort of topic. This will go a long way in building our audience. As I say each week, it'll really help us. But look, with every week, as I say, thank you so much for listening, our regulars and newbies. We're going to have some exciting things being released over the next fortnight with our new Neuralle media service, so keep your eyes peeled. But as with every week, I do hope you all enjoy this conversation with Shayne Hunter. And we are live. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start, Shayne, with your early childhood. So one of the things when I was listening to Josh's interview was your upbringing. So you're born in Adelaide, grew up in Brisbane.
Yep.
You spoke about a relatively normal childhood playing computer games and whatnot.
Yes.
What's your earliest memory of your childhood?
Picking my nose and looking at my boogers.
Okay.
I remember actually being maybe like 2 when you sort of come online and seeing the little thing on the side of the crib or cot thing where you play with that. I remember being spoon-fed by my mum and kind of enjoying that. I remember my dad asking me to count to 10 in front of his friends.
Okay, why was that, do you think?
I don't know, prove that I could count, showing me off. That's probably my first gig.
Right.
I'm a stand-up comedian, so that was probably the first performance I've done in front of a live audience.
Had you always been a bit of a performer?
I think I tend to be extroverted Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any lessons that were taught to you either directly or indirectly by your parents that you still sort of hold with you today?
Don't share needles.
Okay.
I don't know. I would say that it's, there's so much that it would be hard to, condense into a sentence or whatever. But my mum sparked my curiosity. She kind of read me books about biology or whatever. I was very interested in that. And I was dyslexic. And I didn't find out until I was much older in life that I was dyslexic. Right. But that meant I had trouble reading and writing. My reading's better than my writing, but my spelling today and my grammar is still awful. So I wasn't a very good student. And, one of the things that we kind of know from cognitive behavioral therapy is we get sort of beliefs about ourselves implanted into our head, and then we sort of enact those beliefs sometimes. So I had a core belief that I was dumb, and I would filter reality through that belief. And then obviously not being good at school, I would try to amuse the other kids. So that meant that I would sort of, I guess, only be using my ability to entertain and my vocal intelligence with the other kids while failing to do any of the schoolwork.
Wow, okay. So it really reinforced all of that.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah. So the only joy for me in school was trying to make people laugh.
Right, yeah, because, that makes a lot of sense. My partner talks about it all the time. When you're at school and, you don't do well in maths when you're 12 or 13 and a teacher tells you or someone tells you, oh, you're just no good at maths. And then you start to really, it starts to become a story in your head, doesn't it?
Oh, man, it's so fascinating. Yeah, the ways, and it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Which is also very interesting. The classic example, a lot of people will have insecurities around the people they're attracted to, because their idea of them judging you unfavorably is terrifying. So that produces anxiety and whatnot. And so the classic example with the way beliefs will create self-fulfilling prophecies will be imagine someone's at a party and they're a guy and there's an attractive woman there and he's talking to her and then she's like, oh, I've got to go. And so if he's got a core belief that he's unattractive, no woman would ever like him or a woman like that would like him, he might start reacting emotionally to that belief. But he will use that belief as the causal explanation as to why she left, when in reality she could have just been going to get her friends and she was quite enjoying that conversation. Or maybe she's got her own anxieties and she wanted to leave before she had a chance to embarrass herself. So there's all these other possible narratives as to why she did that. But because of the core belief, he interprets that. And then say when she's around again or whatever, he might avoid her because he's feeling that rejection. So because he believed that causal explanation that he is undesirable was the reason she left, it will actually reinforce that belief and he will behave in a way that is likely to, reinforce that rather than disproving that belief. So it's almost like it's almost like he's seen the burning bush like Moses. And that's oh, wow, I've seen a miracle from God proving this belief system I have about myself is true. And then obviously you can apply that to ideology. This idea of being offended and being triggered and people are sort of teaching themselves. It's almost like ideology is like cognitive behavioral therapy in reverse.
Yes.
Because they're implanting certain belief systems that will cause neurotic reactions when cognitive behavioral therapy is trying to find those core beliefs, trying to see whether they're true or not and maybe sort of dispelling them in people's minds so that they can feel less negative emotion unnecessarily. While I feel ideology is planting that into people's heads. So the classic example in my mind that comes to my mind is trigger warnings, right? Mm-hmm. So in some of the universities here, in order for people to feel like they're fighting the good fight, the student unions demanded that trigger warnings be put on in some international classes that talk about genital mutilation and a lot of the severe things that you would have to engage with if you were, studying international relations or trying to understand the world. And so I would suggest that that if you're in a student union group and you're constantly talking about how traumatizing a certain subject is, that's going to increase the belief in your head that when you are exposed to those things, that they are actually traumatizing. Well, if you don't have that expectation, you're less likely to think that. So, for example, I think of an anecdote that my friend told me where his partner was sort of neurotically asking a child who was over at their friend's house if she was okay with hanging out. Like if she wasn't, feeling uncomfortable being away from her family, right? And then the kid was like, no, I'm fine. And then the mum neurotically asked her like 4 more times. And then by like the 4th time, the kid was like, you know what? Maybe I'm not okay here. Do you know what I mean? Because it's sort of that power of suggestion that, well, if an adult thinks that maybe I'm that, maybe I am that adult being that sense of authority, right? And so when it comes to these student groups, the people in the top of the hierarchy of the student union or whatever saying that these things are that, then, oh, well, that's the point of authority and maybe I should trust their opinion. So you're kind of implanting neurotic thoughts. And another classic example would be a thing called a nocebo. Have you ever heard of that? So it's the negative version of a placebo.
Okay.
So a placebo will be like, this will have a positive effect. And then you've got the belief that it will, so you maybe feel a relieving of some negative symptoms, right? So your headache goes away potentially.
Pain or whatever, yeah.
And so a nocebo would be a negative version of that. So an experiment they did is they have a bunch of people, they rig up a normal laser light pen that's harmless if you don't get it in your eyes, and they rig it up so it looks like it's part of some medical or industrial laser. And then they have a bunch of actors sit in a chair and they shine the laser on their arm, and they get these actors to pretend that it really hurts them and it's very painful. And then they've got the actual subject who is the subject of the experiment to see how they will react to these stimuli of seeing other people in pain from this laser light. And so when they sit down and then they're asked to report their pain 1 out of 10, they'll rank it at about 9 or 8.
Wow.
Because they've got the belief and the expectation that that's painful because they've seen other people react to it. Now, if you're in if you're in a peer group where you're told that, you need to save space because our society is so oppressive and racist and homophobic and blah, 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 or that you need trigger warnings or whatever, it can actually lead to your subconsciously disempowering yourself because you've got the expectation that, no, I can't handle the world as it is. So that's how I see the modern feminism as actually disempowering women, Like nowhere in these articles about the pay gap, which maybe we can talk about later, is a bit of a myth. The answer's never work harder. Do you know what I mean? It's like, oh, you want to fix the pay gap? Go make a Fortune 500 company. That might do something, right? It's always about trying to change other people's behavior.
Yeah.
And I guess we can talk about the resentment element of that radical egalitarianism. I've got plenty of examples, but yeah, so that's how I see the whole cognitive, and I had obsessive compulsive disorder. You asked me about my childhood.
Did you?
Yeah, so I had a obsessive compulsive disorder, and I was lucky that it went away in my adolescence. It usually gets worse. I think I just got lazy. Right. But it's sort of, I would have these irrational fears that I would have AIDS as like a 7-year-old. It's completely insane.
I mean, I had generalized anxiety disorder since I was 21, so I can understand. Like, you have totally irrational thought. Like, I'm going to die from a heart attack right now.
Yeah.
And it becomes, you start to, like, search for it. Do you know what I mean? Like,
right.
You start to search for the symptoms. Ooh, what was that feeling in my chest? Ooh.
You're trying to almost get validation for your neuroticism. You're trying to find...
it's crazy.
Well, I actually convinced my parents to get myself a brain scan. My parents and my doctor, to get a brain scan when I was about 14.
Really?
Because I was paranoid I had a brain tumor. God. And then, as you know, X-rays, radiation... damaged DNA increases the chances of a brain tumor. So as soon as I got my brain scanned, I wanted to go back in there
because you thought
I've definitely got it now. I've definitely got it now. I wanted to see that. Like, I basically wanted to be hooked up to a brain scanner thing so I could watch it grow and be like, you see, I'm not fucking crazy. It's there. But yeah, it's so in that sense that I feel that ideology, particularly on top of other kind of disorders, like mental disorders, is a recipe for disaster.
Well, it makes you more susceptible. I mean, what I'm interested by, what you mentioned about the cognitive biases, is what value would there be? Like, I feel like there would be a lot of value in having some form of compulsive psychology in, I don't know whether you have it in schools or university or whatever, but I just believe that would be so incredibly invaluable. Going back to your point about thinking you're dumb, because I mucked around in high school, man. The first 3-4 years, I totally mucked around. And the last 2 years, I paid attention because I had to, essentially. Otherwise, my life was going to be fucked. And it was by the time I was 19 at uni that I was incredibly passionate about learning. Like, I was just an absolute sponge. And I just wonder how much of cognitive biases played into that, thinking, oh, I'm just not, the type to learn this sort of stuff in high school. And particularly like in puberty. Puberty is such a volatile period in your life. I do wonder how valuable a short course in cognitive biases and your own mind would be for young teenagers.
Absolutely. I tend to agree, man. Like, I feel like the entire education system is, that doesn't teach us any real life skills.
No.
It doesn't teach us anything. I mean, think about sex ed. I mean, could you at least teach us how to pick up? Like, for God's sakes, like, you know what I mean? It's like maybe you would have less school shooters if you taught people how to get laid.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And like, not in a coercive way, but like, go become someone valuable that women might respect. Do you know what I mean? And then they'll maybe pay attention to you if you're friendly to them or whatever. But it's that Cole Young quote, which is that until the unconscious is made conscious, we'll be its slave and call it fate. Something like a quote like that. But yeah, I feel like until you become aware of these subconscious processes, you're going to be bound to them. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about the Ash experiment. Do you aware of that one?
No.
So this is the most famous experiment in group psychology group psychology, but with regards to conformity. And so basically the experiment is they get about 10 people in the room. 9 of them are what they call confederates, so people who are told to act a certain way to see how it affects the subject's behavior. They have a scientist stand in front of this group, and he looks like a scientist or whatever, and he's pointing to a placard where it has black columns of clearly different length, just 3 of them on a white placard. So it's very clearly of different lengths, numbered 1 till 3. And then they ask the group, what is the longest column? And then the group will say that the second longest column is the longest, right? And then usually on the first time, the actor will say the correct column. Then they'll do another slide, and then they'll again do the same thing where they say the second longest column is the longest. And about that time, around 70% of the time, people will go along with the group and won't trust their own perception because I think instinctually, like, we're kind of wired for that. But obviously some of the most horrific evils that have ever occurred, human sacrifice,
genocide,
infanticide. A lot of these are based around these kind of group dynamics becoming hyper-pathologized.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I feel that when you're in a society where everyone's telling you, slowly you've gone into this, like, you've divorced the society's relationship with truth, and everyone's being told sort of from the top down that the Jews are the problem, or everyone's being told that we've never had greater production, food production or steel production as it was in Maoist China, which partly led to the extreme famine that happened, which, millions of people starved to death or whatever in Maoist China. Or the Jews being put in ovens in Nazi Germany, I see that those same kind of subconscious forces that give you the results of the Ash experiment are also related to the kind of forces at play when it comes to these totalitarian societies.
Yeah, another good example is I can't remember the name of the experiment, but they have a participant sit down like an actor, and they're rigged up to like an electrical system. And
Milgram experiment, I believe.
I think so, yeah. A lot of these experiments were done after the fall of Nazi Germany, and just showing how willing people were able to conform to an authority of some kind or a group of some kind.
So in case your audience doesn't know, the experiment is they have like a scientist asking someone to push a button, and then through like a glass door where the subject can't see them, they get electric shock. and usually the person's acting or whatever, but the person, the scientist leading the person to push the button will ask them to turn up the voltage, and then that will increase the amount of pain of the subject, and sometimes the pain of the actor who's pretending to be electrocuted. To the point where he even says, "Stop, that's enough." But the scientist is like, "No, keep going."
Yeah.
And I forget what the percentage is, but quite often people will go along.
They'll go the whole way. 80% will go to the point where it's like it's on the dial. It says danger, death. They'll go to that point.
Insane.
It's nuts.
And you know, and so the same kind of, you know, and there's so many other ways that the subconscious will trick us or whatever. I mean, you know, one thing I think about that I've been pondering on recently is like the idea of like, say, jealousy, which is like the idea that, you know, you see someone who is maybe living up to the ideal that you want to be for your life, but you're not there yet, or maybe you can't ever get there or whatever. So you kind of get resentful of them and jealous or whatever. But, you know, we kind of feel the emotion. We feel a hurt by them, and then we associate that hurt with them. And so then we start to maybe hate them, you know, because they bring us negative emotion and whatever, and we don't have that real. If you're not mature, you don't necessarily know that feeling is your own issue. Yeah, and then you'll kind of scan through their characters and all the evidence you have about them, and you'll scan and you'll look for information for a reason why that person's a shit person, and you'll focus on that to help validate those feelings, so you can feel better about that pain that is caused by you by degrading their character, you know. And there's sort of all these kind of subconscious tricks we'll play with ourselves that I think are fascinating, you know. And this is kind of what the whole Buddhism thing was, observations of ancient people trying to get at, how, you know, the pursuit of mindless pleasure or whatever can ultimately lead to an unfulfilled life or whatever. And that, you know, the things we think will make us happy don't necessarily make us happy. They're sort of like an outer manifestation of a deeper issue psychologically that we have. Like, for example, I went through a period where, you know, I had maybe low self-esteem around women or whatever, so I started having a lot of one-night stands, but ultimately that was unfulfilling. And that wouldn't necessarily fix my internal issues. And I think when you see these celebrity breakdowns and meltdowns or whatever, you know, in our society, it's sort of the ideal to become famous and rich or whatever. But, you know, some people who do it, you know, they might experience, you know, a dangerous world of sycophants, or maybe they feel like their fame and wealth isn't deserved, and then they have to deal with the fact that they think they're a fraud, and then everyone in the society is stupid enough to fall for their stuff, so they have to deal with the fact that they're a fraud and everyone's an idiot. And no wonder they shave their hair off and start doing hard drugs or whatever. You know, so I think it's, you know, even Owen Wilson tried to kill himself, man. And, you know, so all these things that we kind of have beliefs that think we're going to make us happy, and, you know, it's all so tricky to navigate, you know. And then ideology at least gives people a kind of certainty, a sort of rigid thing to deal with all that chaos of uncertainty. And they can follow that path and then feel like they're going, no, I'm good. I'm relating to the highest good there is.
Yeah, but it's quite a dangerous path.
It's the most dangerous path there is.
I want to jump back to your own, I guess, journey. You were the point, let's call it the starting point. You were about 15 and you fell into the world of conspiracy. I think you
yeah, I was a little bit older than that. It was about, sort of when I first got the internet, around 16 to kind of 18 or maybe 20.
Right.
I started getting, into conspiracy theory because I guess it's alluring, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, I know the secret truth.
It's like, yes, I've got the map.
It's like all the unknown truth. And I think human beings, our brains want to know the causal explanation behind things or whatever, and when people offering that and then there's a little bit of emotion involved as well, it can be very seductive.
And then you sort of moved to what you call right-wing libertarianism, so sort of Ron Pauls of the world. And then somehow, which I can't understand the flip here, you fell into anarchism.
So with right-wing libertarianism, it's sort of we'll mainly put all the kind of evil in the world at the hands of the state, that when the state can interfere in our lives, it makes mistakes and it makes our lives worse. I mean, that's sort of a simplification of the idea, right? And sort of usually it will point to the evils of like what happened in communist societies when absolute power of the group, of the state over the individual leads to evil, awful outcomes, right? And so, and great inefficiencies as well. And so that made me go, yeah, communism sucks. We should be free. That, resonated with me. But so I started to get concerned about the possible Western intervention in Syria, which looks like it could happen again.
Yeah. But why were you concerned about that?
I was concerned about that because I thought it could lead to a chain of events that could lead to a thermonuclear war.
But did you genuinely believe that?
I genuinely believe that. And just like core beliefs, or like when you're obsessive compulsive, if you think the world's going to end and you think there's a realistic chance of a nuclear war, and you just see your mates just like fucking going, "Good day, Gary," and not doing anything about it, and then you kind of see a group of people who seem to be relating to that, you'll gravitate towards those people. And that's kind of what happened to me. So I started going to these anti-war protests in a way of going, no, the West shouldn't join that, and blah, blah, blah.
You understand, though, that a lot of it was a proxy war, right?
Yeah, I didn't know enough at the time to make a competent evaluation, for sure. Yeah, and I thought that, that the proxy wars hypothetically can lead to hot wars between countries, like it's happened before.
Yeah. And
I want to say that it's impossible that nuclear war wouldn't happen, but it's maybe not as likely as I thought it would.
No.
All right? But yeah, so anyway, I tried to get into that. And, the other thing is we always pick the most virtuous narrative for why we do things, right? So, one of my jokes in my show at the moment is how I would boast to my friend how I've never paid for sex and how, awesome I am for never doing that. But then upon reflection, I realized the only reason I've never done that is because I've never had the disposable income to be able to afford it. But I've counted that off as discipline or whatever. And similarly, perhaps I wondered to what degree was me getting involved in this anti-war stuff away from escaping my own problems. And and that begs a bigger question: does ideology allow people to escape from their own issues? Right, so ideologies usually point to the grand political narratives, the big picture. The fate of millions of people are determined by, the structures of society, and that's so much more important than my little life, right? So, for example, the great Aussie patriot would put out a common right-wing talking point, which is there's 10,000 homeless people, in Melbourne. Mate, let's fix them before we look after the refugees, mate. Let's fucking look after our own yard before we fucking bring in other people, our own yard. But apparently this guy who's saying that has a bunch of children to multiple women he isn't involved in raising. So if you actually believe that logic, it's mate, before you worry about the fucking immigrants, maybe you raise your own kids. Do you see how he's kind of applying the logic to the big picture but not his own life?
Yeah.
So
they use it as a method of ignoring their own problem.
Yeah, because the grand narrative is bigger in terms of its, how many people it's affecting.
It places significance on your life.
And it's also will inflate your ego because you're relating to something really important.
Yeah.
So, for example, think about the psychology of procrastination, right? So, have you ever found yourself having to do some task or work task or whatever that's kind of hard and intimidating to start, but then you're well, rationally, I do have to do my laundry, so I'll do that now, but that's actually a way for you to trick yourself into not having to face that hard task, right? So, whenever I've got something hard to do, my room never looks tidier, right? So I would suggest that these grand ideological narratives are a form of spiritual procrastination. And I mean spirit in terms of relating to the highest morality or whatever. So you got your first order drives, which is food, sex, whatever. Second order drives, career, friends, whatever. And then maybe third order drives, which is okay, you got a day to live. You're going to go maybe tell your dad that you love him or some shit that you kind of don't want to do because it's kind of hard and you have to be vulnerable or whatever. So, and you can kind of put that off because he's not going to die anytime soon or whatever. You can kind of avoid that. So I feel that it's a form of procrastination. These ideologies allow you to go, oh, it's worrying about the homelessness or the refugees is cleaning the dishes when he's got kids to raise. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's how I see that. So to what degree was my involvement in the journey towards activism a way to escape the burdens of my own life.
So it's an extreme form of procrastination.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to wash up the dishes for the whole world rather than do the shit you need to do in your life.
Yeah, and I feel that the antithesis of that is a lot of what Jordan Peterson says, and we'll get into him soon.
But another aspect I just wanted to say about it, what was I thinking? Well, you know the psychology of like if you don't try, can't fail.
Yes.
Right. So like, hard to find an example of it off the top of my head right now, but I think you understand the principle, and hopefully your listeners do. But to some degree, maybe ideology is that thing of like, on some level, you know that your individual action can't change the whole world, but then you can also feel really moral because you're trying to, but then, you know, you can't really fail if you like support utopia.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So you can kind of avoid failure.
You shared something about Brett Weinstein, and I've listened to a lot of his talks now. You shared something recently. I'm just interested if you've built an opinion on what is the biological basis for why we do this. Like, why do we procrastinate? Why do we skip pain when we could sort of see that it results in a good outcome?
It's very interesting, and it's hard to say because not everyone does that, right?
Like, is it really that... I just wonder, have we become more like this because we've got more things that sort of trick the lizard brain component?
Seductive pleasure.
Yeah, like we're
sometimes I feel like I'm just a bunch of bad habits masquerading as a personality. Do you know what I mean? Like all the little distractions that we confront or whatever. But the other thing that I think about procrastination is like, think about like the term deadline.
Okay.
Right? Like, do you think it's an accident we call it a deadline? So if you don't do this by this point in time, you've missed that opportunity. You're going to lose a job or you're not going to get that promotion, and your chances for survival and reproduction are being reduced, right? Death is a consequence. It's the deadline, right? So what I mean is like other animals will feel anxiety, say a gazelle, because it sees the tiger or lion or whatever off in the distance. It's like anxious. It's like, oh, fuck, I got to get ready. With a deadline or with some sort of task that's looming, because human beings can kind of see into the future, right? We're like shitty psychics. Like we know in a month's time that shit's going to happen, but it's not as real as the immediate now. But we still have a vague sense of like a looming sense of something bad's going to happen or something confronting or something hard or difficult's happening, right? So we can kind of feel like that deadline, that task you have to do is almost like stalking you like a lion, because it's triggering the same sense of anxiety that if you don't do this, get this thing done before the deadline, it's going to eat you. Do you know what I mean? So It's actually activating the same part of the brain that would have evolutionarily been responsible for threat detection and producing that anxiety. But because our brains are bigger, we can see that off into the future, like months away. And so what do you do when you're anxious? Well, you try to get positive emotion because you're experiencing such negative emotion. And how do you do that? Well, you can do that with drugs and alcohol, video games, fucking Facebook, whatever. Wanking, right? Like how many times have you wanked to distract yourself from the pain of a deadline, right? Like I'm pretty sure if a gazelle could jack off, it might. But and so that's one of the core reasons. But you're right in that it is kind of so irrational because I almost feel like sometimes it takes more energy to procrastinate than to do the fucking job.
Yeah.
Because your heart starts racing. Do you know what I mean? It's like I've started a new cardio program, which is that I leave things to the last minute and I get my cardio goes up. And sometimes my heart skips a beat just to show off, you know what I mean?
I just wonder why you get that mental push. Like I have a sort of algorithm in my head when I have a task that has that pushback mentally where I'm just like, oh, I don't want to really do this. I just go, okay, just half an hour, timer on, and no distractions for this, and just see how far I can get. And just do that and just push through the procrastination. And often you find you break through that and you go on working for an hour or whatever it may be, however long
the hardest point starting for sure, man.
Yeah.
And I also think, from some of the stuff I've read about how to deal with procrastination, it's like, like this guy who's just pumped out 1 million books or whatever, his thing was like, look, for 15 minutes, if 15 minutes I can just write 100 words, that's all I have to do. So he takes the stress off the ideal. Because the other thing that happens, I think, with the procrastination thing is like, So, you know, we have our ideal and we have our values, but those combined maybe are an ideal version of yourself that you want to manifest in the future, right? And that ideal is judging you harshly. And where was I going with this? So I sometimes feel that, like, if you allow your imagination to create such an ideal of what your life's gonna be like, it's hard to live up to that ideal, and any step away from that ideal is almost like a failure, or it's not good enough because it's not quite the ideal. But if you kind of just change that ideal, instead of being this like God you're trying to manifest in yourself, and you just make it like, no, just sit here for 15 minutes. That's all you have to do. You don't have to sit there thinking about how you're going to have a six-pack and fucking $1 million and a bunch of beautiful women, and you're going to work 12 hours a day, every day, forever. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if you experience that, but do you have an ideal self that you feel you don't measure up to? And because you don't measure up to that, you judge yourself harshly, and then that sometimes can make you feel like you're a loser. And that feeling of that pain of feeling like a loser can drive you towards more instant gratification.
Definitely in an earlier stage of my life, but I've sort of broken through a lot of that now. But yeah, I definitely compare myself to an ideal in a year, 2 years, whatever. That can be the case when particularly like you're working on projects. Like if you're trying to launch, like with us, we're trying to launch this service. We've got this whole ideal. You start a podcast, you think, oh yeah, I'm gonna immediately start.
You're gonna be Joe Rogan.
Yeah, Joe Rogan. Yeah, and then you start comparing yourself. You get a bit down, but you sort of just need to. I think that just requires better planning at some point.
Well, it's the balance between the ideal and realism, you know, and that's why pragmatism's a better fucking ideology than this Marxist shit.
Yeah.
Right, but. Yeah, I feel like, you know, you want to keep it realistic, but I think when you kind of, I don't know, I feel like certain people who are very creative or whatever can create these monsters of an ideal, you know?
I want to jump into Antifa. What is it?
It's a cancer. No, what it is basically it's the militant end of the far left. They see themselves as trying to disrupt the organizing of radical right-wingers basically through terrorist tactics. So physical confrontations, threatening them, giving them death threats, trying to make them lose their jobs. The only problem with that is one, it's not clear that doing that stops the far right because it gives them something to rally around.
Yeah,
it gives them free PR. L. Ron Hubbard, an occultist master, because he created Scientology, said that the best way to bind people together is to have a common enemy. Mm-hmm. So the best way you can take all these lunatic right-wingers and kind of put them into a cohesive unit is to give them a common enemy. And then the other thing they do is they give them free PR. So there's a thing called the Streisand effect. The Streisand effect is the idea that when you try and suppress certain information, you kind of make it bigger. So, for example, it comes from Barbra Streisand. There's some photographer who was taking photos of real estate in one of the rich areas in Beverly Hills or whatever, and her house or one of her houses got on that site and it had like 10 views. Like, no one's looking at this fucking site. And then she's like, take it down. And he's like, no, I don't have to. I don't have I'm allowed to do this. And then through that court case and making a big deal about it, it ended up becoming this big internet meme and everyone was posting a fucking house around. So it got millions of views because she was trying to suppress that information. So another example would be the riots at Berkeley. So Antifa at Berkeley University tried to suppress, stop Milo Yiannopoulos from being able to speak. And by carrying on, trying to smash their way into the venue and burning parts of the uni and setting things on fire and violently attacking people who wanted to see him, consequently, the next day, TV stations from all around the world wanted to talk to this guy, and his book sales went through the roof.
Yeah.
And so the Streisand effect, I think, is something that, as much as these Antifa people think they're courageously stopping the spreading of poisonous radical right-wing ideas, I think they're actually helping them do that. Mm-hmm. And then the other problem with Antifa is that, well, one of the problems is that Yeah, I mean, it's completely illegal. So there's an argument that when you, like, the reason you defer violence to the state is, like, say if someone attacks your brother, you got the police who will deal with it and justice will happen. You don't have to get you and your mates to go bash that dude and create a cycle of violence. So that's the other thing Antifa does that is dangerous. The other aspect is that they subjectively define who's fascist. So there's been people from Antifa Sydney who've assaulted other left-wing people because they had a disagreement over, like, the Assadist regime or what the politics in Syria is right now. Legitimately just assaulted this dude in the street, right? Because they've normalized the principle that their interpretation of fascism trumps anything. So, and then they've normalized the principle that violence is okay. So I think Antifa is a dangerous group. And I think that, you know, things like the Weather Underground, you know, did result in innocent people getting killed in bombs. And, you know, in a hypothetical scenario in Australia, if political polarization continued to increase or whatever, you could see more, you know, someone could get killed. And I certainly think it's dangerous the way that Antifa encourages people to go to these rallies to protest the far right. Because a lot of people who are, like, young and naive who go, oh, well, I don't like the far right, and maybe they don't fully have their heads around how dangerous the radical left wing is because, you know, a hammer and sickle doesn't look as evil as a swastika to people. That, you know, they encourage these young people, or not even young or whatever, but just sort of naive people who are maybe centre left to go to these rallies, put themselves at risk of physical danger, of getting criminal charges, which might impede the rest of their life, and all while the while not even clearly having any hard proof that this stops the far right at all. So I think Antifa is a disgrace, and I'm ashamed that I was ever part of it, and I let myself be led down the path to subscribe to that stuff. And I also think there's a lot of people who are after violence, but they want a ideological narrative to be able to justify it. So one of the leaders of Antifa Sydney would always go to football hooligan things, and under the guise of trying to recruit them into Antifa. But yeah, he would just mindless violence. Well, like one football team fan group would attack another one violently in the street. A homicide or permanent brain damage or permanent injury could occur at any point, and probably has in these scenarios. But they do it. It's insane.
To what level were you involved?
I went to court 3 times over that stuff. I was found not guilty, and I was involved in organising rallies and events and stuff, and you know, trying to do fundraisers and events to try and recruit people into this stuff and to promote Antifa. And I helped set up the social media aspect of it, and I organised quite a few rallies, but one of the main ones I did was the protest against Reclaim Australia, the first one in Brisbane. I set up, like, the calling meetings that got all the radical left-wingers, like anarchists and communist factions, together to try to pull their energies together to confront the radical right-wingers or whatever the fuck we were trying to do. And, yeah, on the day I was there, I had a speaker role, like I was helped facilitating it. And, yeah, I'd organised all the politically correct token box ticking of different kinds of minorities to speak on that event, as well as opening it up to an open mic. And then funnily enough, on that day and I paid out of my own pocket for the PA, and I got up at like 5 a.m. to pick up the PA, and I did all this shit, right? And it was funny, on the day, someone who never attended any of the meetings, some woman wearing a mask on her face, I could hear her say while I was on the mic, "I can't believe there's a white guy on the mic." Which was funny because if you looked over my shoulder, you could see a woman on the mic, Pauline Hanson. So I guess the right wingers are more inclusive than us. And then I asked her, I'm like, "Oh, sorry, would you like to speak on the mic?" And she said no. Of course, it's so typical. It's like they're not. And this is the other aspect of the thing that I was kind of alluding to before, is that they're not actually interested in bettering themselves. They don't like the unequal outcomes of people in society. They don't believe in a meritocracy because their ideological narratives explain everything as based on oppression. And there's certainly a case to be made that there's elements of society that are oppressive, and maybe life itself is oppressive. But there's also a counter argument, the yin-yang symbol. There is a degree of meritocracy, you know, and competence, and a competence making up some part of the social hierarchy. And I would suggest that in Australia compared to other societies, I mean, this is the thing, is these people have no real knowledge of history. I mean, go look at the Bronze Age or whatever, but, you know, to some degree, you know, maybe in Australia that there is you can move up the social hierarchy based on competence in a way that other societies haven't been able to allow for that to happen to the degree that it happens in our society. So there's no gratitude with this ideology. It's sort of like, you know, those videos of like a 14-year-old girl gets like a new car, right? And she's like, yeah, it's just like a Ferrari. Where it's like, I wanted a Porsche, Dad. You're the worst dad ever. Fuck you. You know, that kind of shit. It's almost like these young people have no real knowledge of history. They've been taught this easy way out that everything's oppression, and they don't have any gratitude or understanding of how many thousands of fucking years it took to get to this point. That have a society where like innocent until proven guilty and free speech and all these great things we have. It's like, hey, we've got this great car for you. We've got this Australian society. We've got the most ethnically diverse population in the world, and we're not all stabbing each other. You know, look at this. Look. We got the highest minimum wage in the world. We got great working conditions, great safety, you know. Nah, fuck you. You know what I mean? It's like the 14-year-old girl that doesn't have any gratitude. And the other thing is like, you know, back to just the individual philosophy or whatever, like I was trying to write in that cafe just before about how gratitude is the antidote to resentment, in my opinion. So, for example, I was writing about how we get resentful of like we lose gratitude for what we have in life. Or like, oh, how come I'm not constantly getting my dick sucked and having millions of dollars or whatever? Like, why does God hate me so much, right? But then, you know, you don't have gratitude for what you have, and like any refugee or whatever would see my life as a perpetual state of bliss because it's all relative, right? So that's why I think if I was waterboarded for 5 minutes every morning, I would have more gratitude. Because I'll be like, well, I'm not being waterboarded now. I can enjoy this or whatever. And actually, that's if you listen to Jordan Peterson long enough, he talks about how in initiation ceremonies in different cultures, the reason they do that is to have a reference point for suffering, to basically make that the hard shit you're going to encounter in your life, you're going to be better equipped to it because you've encountered something bad. Right? So you've got a reference point for suffering. Like if you've never experienced any real suffering in your life, dropping your ice cream on the ground could be like devastating psychologically. Like you'd be like bedridden for like a week going, oh my God, that ice cream was so good. What happened? Right? Yeah. So I feel like this ideology promotes pure resentment because the narrative is that everything's predicated on oppression. Everything's unfair. And it just fosters this fucking dark, hate-filled resentment in people, and there's nothing in this ideology to promote gratitude. So it's promoting like a school shooter mindset.
Yeah, I want to jump to media and tactics that they use to permeate this through society. As I said before to you, me and my production assistant, we sat down and we were talking about how it gets moved throughout society and all these sort of sycophantic things become normalized by politicians or leaders in society. But I think maybe it's important first that we go through the actual ideology, like get a foundation of how do they believe the world works?
All right. So what do these people believe? So the radical left-wingers, what do they believe? Well, there's a multiple, what's the word in religion where it's like Protestant, Catholics, denominations? There's a few denominations, but a lot of the main things they have in common is a rejection of capitalism.
Is it a rejection of capitalism or a rejection of Western democracy and capitalism?
Well, they don't see there being a difference.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? So, well, basically, how do I sum up their belief systems, right? So they believe that capitalism is only predicated on oppression. They believe that private property is illegitimate. And so, for example, I'll give you an indication of how this works in the way that they think, right? So there was a thing that Marx wrote about the enclosures, right? So there was a process when capitalism became capitalism where private property could become abstracted and represented by pieces of paper that the state would guarantee that that piece of paper meant that that person owned that property, and then they could exchange that piece of paper to other people who could afford to buy it. And so it created absentee ownership or private property, right? So radical leftists will see that process as being completely illegitimate and unnatural. And you know what? Maybe it could be. Who knows? Because the state guarantees a degree of violence that will maintain that property. So based on that understanding, I came to perceive private property as being based purely on coercion and violence, because you had a centralized state that will use violence to guarantee. And, you know, talk about legitimate ownership, right? So people who in support of capitalism will say, well, people should be able to own property because they've mixed their labor with the land. They've worked, they should own the fruit of their labor. But after successive generations, you get to the person where someone might own 1,000 bits of property, where other people, in order to access the means of life, have to engage on the terms of the property owner and work for them at a disempowered bargaining position, where they sell their labor to the property owner, so the property owner gets the bulk of the value of that other person's labor that they can use to reinvest and expand in their growing personal empire. So, so in that abstraction, I perceived all work as this illegitimate form of coercion based on a system that shouldn't exist. So, for example, the reason circus animals will do unnatural things like tricks where like a lion will jump through a burning hoop is because the lion tamer has deprived the animal of food and water and the means of life without doing that activity. And so that's how I would perceive someone working at IGA. That person mopping the floors at IGA is only doing it so they can access the means of life, shelter, so pay rent, and food, right? And water or whatever. And so I would perceive that as like a circus animal, right? That person was doing an unnatural activity with their time. And then there's an existential element that I think the leftists point to that has an element of truth, is that, you know, life shouldn't be about toiling away in a sweatshop for someone else's profit, you know? So as much as we can kind of see the irrational, dangerous elements of the radical left and the madness, the evil things they'll do to in the name of their ideology for their utopian ends to alleviate that, they do point to real issues. Right. So, so that's classical Marxism. It's basically this idea of private property being illegitimate, and that maybe we could move to a alternative system where the property, instead of being based on absentee ownership, could be based on usage rights. So you could use that property and maintain control and authority over it as long as you maintain the property and that you're using it, and that you could alleviate absentee ownership. Now, could a society function on that? I've no idea. Right? Would that be better than the system we have? No idea. Right? But that was sort of the utopian socialist vision of like people like Karl Marx, right? So that was very seductive, particularly for like in Europe at the time, where like whole families were working in coal mines. You know, there's a reason why these ideas took root. And then so modern Marxism, which is called, you know, people call it neo-Marxism, takes that same oppressor and oppressed dichotomy. So most people in the modern age will see capitalism as both having that oppressive element as well as having a symbiotic relationship between workers and bosses. So the girl who makes manager at Macca's, the 18-year-old, over the girl who didn't, you know, it might have something to do with the fact that the girl who became manager would come to work all the time and wouldn't, you know, come over hungover an hour late, right? So there's a degree of meritocracy and symbiotic relationships between workers and bosses, as well as oppressive elements. You know, there are cases where bosses do have the incentive to try and cut wages and work conditions. So there's always this tension between that. But I don't think it's solely... so Marxism creates that there's no individuals, there's only classes, and group identity comes first, and that workers and bosses are in a power struggle, that ultimately one class has to beat the other class, and that's the workers' revolution, right? And then you get rid of the classes and you have a classless society, and all that evil or oppressive elements or the hardships of capitalism, they envision being removed through this idea of class struggle. So the socialist utopians had a few ways of doing it through taking over parliament. So that's how we get the modern social democrat movement, like Labour, or maybe even the Greens or whatever. And then the other strategy was a violent revolution with a vanguard party who would take over the apparatus of the state and would use that to redistribute resources until eventually it would wither away. And that was the Leninist model. And then the other one was the anarchist one. So this is what I became. I was an anarchist, which is anarcho-syndicalism, the idea that just like how workers can have a strike or they can occupy their workplace in order to shut down profits until the bosses give in to the demand. What happens is that these bosses would form workers' councils, so that you would democratically take over workplaces with the workers, and you would kick out the bosses permanently, and that the workers, instead of bosses or absentee ownerships owning the means of production, factories, farms, or whatever, the workers would own them collectively through democratic councils. And that was very seductive to me and a lot of people, because in history we saw it go from monarchs to republics, where you have elected officials or whatever representing different parts of the country, right? And then they would debate in parliaments as to what to be done. So it was easy for people in the 1800s to perceive that these anarcho-syndicalist ideas of workers' democracy being the next step. So instead of having a owner who's kind of like a king who can mandate what happens, it would move towards a more and more democratic system within the workplace itself, which would hopefully be more socially optimum, right? So the capitalist system would be overthrown in what's called a general strike, where everyone goes on strike, but it will be a general revolutionary strike. So everyone goes on strike, but all the workers kick the bosses out of the workplace. So it's a very seductive idea or whatever. And so it seemed that, when you believe that's possible or whatever, you have a causal narrative to believe that the things like war, poverty, all these things that would cause tremendous suffering could be alleviated through this utopian ends. So that's what I was working towards. So that's the kind of classical thing. So the neo version of Marxism takes that same workers versus bosses, where it's just there's no individuals, there's just group identities in a power struggle, and they split that to a racialized and gender version. So instead of workers and bosses, it's men versus women and white people versus black people. Because if you look at the outcomes in Western societies, men have as a group, men have better outcomes than women, and white people as a group has better outcomes than black people in say Australia. But the problem with that idea is that there's a small portion of men who have a huge amount of wealth, right? Because they're at the top of the competence hierarchy. And if you actually look at IQ distribution, you have more geniuses. So men and women have the same average IQ, but there'll be a greater percentage of men who have crazy high IQs, but then you also have a greater percentage of men who are retarded, right? Have very low IQs, because nature, it seems, takes more risk with the male, right?
Because they're a bit more disposable.
Yeah, men are more disposable than women in nature for a survival of the species. So what that means is that, when they talk about the pay gap and how men are the majority of CEOs and stuff, they fail to mention that the majority of homeless people are actually men. So it actually turns out men are the biggest winners and the biggest losers.
Right.
Right. And women have it safer in the middle. Right. On average. And so the same thing is, so the differences between individuals and groups is greater than the differences between groups.
Yeah, so the statistical average is different to the outliers in a lot of groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And and that's why it's so stupid and racist and bigoted to say things like white male privilege. It's like, what the hell does that even mean? Because, it's the differences between, say, if you group people arbitrarily by these classes and you go, okay, white men, the differences between, say, you and the homeless person we walk by is greater than the average differences between white people, black people, men and women. Right? There's actually a greater variation of people in groups than between groups. And that's why, the sovereignty of the individual is so important. Right? And that's one of the things I think Western civilization got right. And that's why we have things like habeas corpus and free speech, right? And that the state should be subordinated to the individual and not the individual subordinated to the state. But there is a case to be made with these ideologies. So when I was talking about the enclosures and absentee ownership and all this stuff, so the version that they will point to that's true is like, I think it probably is true sometimes. There may be a culture in which women are overlooked based on their merits to not get manager positions. Sometimes it's like, oh, we don't want a chicken charge, right? I'd say that there is an element of that in society. The problem is they take those things and they make it a universal, and that's the only causal explanation of the different outcomes.
Right.
There's one causal explanation, oppression, and they think they're the masters of the universe, right? So like if you put a neo-Marxist in the Large Hadron Collider where they shoot particles at half the speed of sound and, half the speed of light into into each other to see what happens. Any result that happens in the Large Hadron Collider, they would explain it as oppression because they have one causal explanation for everything. Right. The example I use is like the idiot idea of microaggressions, where a white person says to a black person, "Where are you from?" And they go, "Oh, Sydney." Well, no, where are you really from? Meaning, what's your background? That to them is an example of white supremacy and racism and white privilege and male entitlement. It's like, man, you can't judge your interpretation. You can't judge the intention. And again, we're going back to what I was talking about with the causal explanation based on core beliefs. So if you got back when I was talking about low self-esteem, that's why the chick walked away when she could just be going to talk to her friend. Similarly, they have these ideas planted in their brain that's the only causal explanation is oppression, right? When in reality, a lot of mixed race children, their parents could have had that kind of conversation in the first minutes that they met each other, and it could actually be an indication of general interest rather than some grand group identity trying to enforce the oppression and power onto the minority or whatever the fucking garbage they're on. But so these are the narratives and some of the core beliefs of this ideology. And when I was an ideologue, I would explain these things through those narratives. Right?
You'd find it in everything.
I find it in everything. And so the thing is, it sounds really dumb on the surface, but if you're smart and somewhat creative, you can create narratives around this. So there's a thing called critical theory, which isn't critical thinking, but they teach this horseshit at unis, and this is part of the problem. Critical theory will just basically you take any bit of art or literature or whatever and try to explain it through how this is upholding these systems of systemic oppression. So I could apply critical theory to Batman. So Batman, the story of Batman is he becomes orphaned because his parents, who are wealthy millionaires, billionaires, are mugged in an alleyway, right? So let's apply critical theory to that. So what really was going on is that maybe these entrepreneurs, these ruling class fuckers have gotten their unearned wealth through oppressing the workers, and they closed down one factory, which led to the poverty of this mugger, who then enacted righteous class warfare against these evil industrialists and took them for all that they're worth, right? And Batman, instead of using all that unearned wealth to cure malaria, he spent those hundreds of millions of dollars on silly gadgets so he could go around enforcing crime. And what causes crime? Well, a lot of it's poverty, right? So it's basically like if Bill Gates' son got a jetpack and some nunchucks and went around beating up poor people, right? So you see how critical theory can be applied? It
sort of seems like auditing in Scientology.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's sort of a reinforcement system or process.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this is how the postmodernism works. It's sort of like, so postmodernism, so in like the 90s, postmodernism deserves no credibility. So postmodernism, there's smarter people talk about this, but basically it was a reaction to when the Marxists realized the Soviet Union was a nightmare and wasn't this utopian fantasy. So they kind of had to move away from Marxism. They created a thing called postmodernism, which is that there is no grand narrative, and because anything can be interpreted in an infinite number of ways, everything's subjective. And you can easily debunk that. I think there is an objective reality, because when someone's hit by a car, no one's yelling out, "Is there a postmodernist in the neighborhood?" Right? We're asking for a doctor because there's an objective biological reality that's happening, and it's hard to argue against suffering. Like when someone's split open half in the pavement, we're not going, "Oh, there's so many ways of interpreting that," right? Like we have to deal with a reality, right? And so in that sense, but their idea is that, so the psychologists like Freud or whatever, they realized in about the 1920s that we will often project our beliefs onto reality, filter reality through our beliefs, as opposed to looking at reality to formulate our beliefs. And so in that sense, my explanation, that's why you see more people, more Christian fundamentalists reporting seeing Jesus' face in burnt toast than you hear about atheists reporting seeing Charles Darwin's face in burnt toast, because they've got the expectation. And right. Again, we're talking about those core beliefs, like the dude who interprets the woman walking away because he hates himself and so she must hate him, right? So we only see such a keyhole part of it. So okay, they've got that observation correct, the postmodernists, right? But the problem,
so there are real problems in society, and their system allows them to explain it through oppression.
The problem the postmodernists have is that it's almost like they like matter up on their Jesus toast. They have the knowledge that some people are going to see Jesus toast, so with their reality. Some people are going to come with their biases that might be a result of the socioeconomic identity group demographic they may randomly be part of, right? You know, it's probably true on some level. Like, you probably haven't been called like, I've got mates who are brown skin comics who've been heckled with like, hey, monkey, or like a female friend comic who's got like big tits who, you know, has been heckled like jump, right? There's definitely truth in that certain demographics might experience different shit on average, right? But the problem is they assume, they kind of make that assumption, but then they assume that their problem is their version of Jesus toast is assuming that you're Jesus toasting, right? So I project my belief that you're seeing things through your belief based on your group identity. So postmodernism makes the same fucking mistake that it claims other people are making.
I see.
So they're like measuring up on their Jesus toast.
Dude, it becomes very... Wow, you're really doing mental gymnastics for this.
Yeah.
It's nuts.
Yeah. Well, you know, when you leave a cult, you tend to go, what the fuck happened to me? Like, you tend to like go, you have some questions around this stuff. But,
so how do what do they use to normalize this in society?
Well, what they do is they take the mainstream values, and I think it is a mainstream. Like, I think most people are repulsed around the idea of racism, the idea of sexism, the idea of rape, the idea of discrimination. You know, luckily these are mainstream values. Like, people find them morally repulsive. But what these fuckers do is they take those mainstream values, they redefine what constitutes those things, and they use it for social power. So, for example, this could have happened unconsciously maybe. So, for example, if you're in a shopping center and a kid goes, Mom, and they chuck a tantrum to get the lolly, they notice that, oh, well, Mom caved in, I can do that behavior again. So if I start going, racism, and if it's a mainstream people turn around and pay attention to me, right? So let's think of another thing that happened psychologically, right? So there was a woman who wasn't a victim of 9/11 who claimed to be a victim of 9/11, made up some horseshit story about losing her fiance in the tower, and she was in the other tower and she survived. And she actually became the media kind of person to lead the survivors group and would host these meetings. Total fraud. Oh, wow. But how do you get into that? How did she psychologically get into that? Well, we all love attention. So if I say something, I know that I get validation. It's almost like a hit of a drug. The same process for addiction, right? So she exaggerates one story one day, people kind of pay attention. Oh, wow, you were there. She's the center of attention now. And then she exaggerates a little bit more and a little bit more and a little more until she's concocted this whole fantasy.
Well, it's also a bit of like the commitment and consistency principle. Like, she can't go back from that.
Yeah, she can't go back.
Yeah.
Fuck yeah. And so I suggest that one of the reasons this ideology is so insipid and insidious is that it kind of wedges into these mainstream values and warps them and redefines them. The only problem is what I see happening. So I'll give you an example of how they redefine them, right? So cultural appropriation. White people can't have dreadlocks. It's black culture. You're stealing from our culture. You're taking it away. That's cultural appropriation. So racism's no longer someone not being hired on the job because of there's some arbitrary thing like their skin color. It's now based on like white people can't have dreadlocks, right? You know, they're redefining it. It's like, oh, you know, white people. I've even heard people twisting this into like it's racist for white people to eat sushi. Like, the only trains that are more racist than the trains going to Auschwitz are the sushi trains white people are eating off, right? So,
you know, I've got a lot of Jewish friends, and I grew up in a Jewish community, and this thing really grinds their gears because people do use this form of language.
Yeah, I'm glad it grinds their gears, right? And it fucking should.
Yeah.
And so they'll redefine, and they even do this to rape, which is sickening, right? Like, I totally agree that there are Harvey Weinsteins but then there's, you know, the yin yang of it, of like whores who are happy to suck dick to move ahead and who help enable that, you know, conveniently gets left out of the equation. But, you know, like, I've seen posters and stuff where they say, like, if you're drunk and she's drunk, you raped her, which infantiles women because they're no longer responsible for their actions because they're part of this oppressed group, you know, which is stupid, and they don't have individual responsibility for sleeping someone when they're drunk or whatever. But because you're not fully lucid when you're intoxicated, you can't give informed consent, thus it's rape. So they become puritanical, right? So they take mainstream values like being against rape, being against sexism, being against racism. They redefine it. And I think what they're actually doing is they're cannibalizing the social fabric. So I don't know how many fucking thousands of years it took for that to become a mainstream value, like racism's wrong. How many people needed to be lynched or murdered or put in camps or whatever for us to finally get our fucking heads around how dumb it is and create a cohesive society. These people are taking that social fabric like fucking worms or termites eating something so that they can have a hit of instant gratification through redefining it. So these people are cannibalizing the social fabric for instant gratification, and they're actually undermining that social fabric where it creates a perfect smoke screen for actual racism because, you know, enough people cry wolf. People aren't going to turn around when someone hears racism. Like, people are getting over it. They're like, there's people who have gotten false rape accusations, which makes it harder for those people, their friends, to then believe someone when they say that shit in the future. They're actually doing the opposite. Just like Antifa is creating the radical right-wingers, these people may be creating the racism and the sexist they're trying to avoid, and the fucking rapists they're trying to avoid, right? So it's such a head fuck, because the problem is knowing that there's a problem in society is very different from understanding what's causing it and how to go about fixing it. And if you don't know what causes it or how to fix it, and you try and relate to it as if you know those things, you could be making them worse. And that's what I suggest these neo-Marxists are doing.
What did it teach you about the right, being involved in these group ideas and clashing with these right-wing groups?
What did it teach me about the right? Yeah. The right wing, like the radical right wing? Well, at the time, you know, it taught me a little bit about the history of fascism or whatever, but now upon reflection, like what I can understand is it's very fucking similar. It's so similar. I'll just say, like, there's slightly different personality characteristics and then a lot of overlapping similarly personality characteristics. They're quite similar to each other. The fascists and the neo-Marxists are quite similar in their personality type. Absolutist, inability to self-examine, because the real moralities, you know, there's no one who's going to have a like page or a cause to make you do the right things in your life. Yeah. You know, there's no one like creating changing their profile picture like, I want Shayne to stop eating junk food and eat more leafy greens. You know what I mean? Like, I want Shayne to write a gratitude letter to his grandmother or whatever. All the real morality, you know, no one's going to fucking have a bandwagon for you to do, right? There's no validation from the mob you can get. So I feel like these fascists and neo-Marxists fail to see the difference between their own persona and their authentic self. So the persona is your face in the public sphere. And so you can kind of, it's a lie because it's not as deep or as authentic. So you can become an actor for the mob, and then you can champion the causes of the mob to get validation. So that's what I see happening with both the radical left wing and the radical right wingers and the people involved. They become actors for the mob until eventually they lose their authentic identity, and they don't have the maturity to see the difference between their persona and themselves, and they get lost in their own fucking bullshit.
Yeah, and I think this is really amplified with the fact that we live in the world with the internet. Like you said to me, oh no, you didn't say it to me, but you said in another video that there are videos that never go viral. You know, like everyone focuses on, they're always scanning for the video that goes viral about some racist prick on a bus. But no one focuses on the fact that there's, you know, a whole bunch of dudes just sitting on a bus, minding their own business, listening to Spotify. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. It's like the anomaly becomes the norm based on that anomaly producing outrage, which produces views and attention, and the algorithms on Facebook reward that. So there's like I think a friend of mine who was reading a scientific journal said that the quote in that was the outrage industrial complex, right? Which is quite funny. But yeah, outrage sells, you know, and so that exacerbates it. The profit motive on social media seems to have warped and gets into our vulnerabilities, almost like it's like a psychological version of cigarettes. You know, how many times do people, you know, outside of the conspiracy kind of thinking of mobile phones causing cancer, which, you know, seems it might or whatever, there's also that thing of like, how many hours do you spend on this fucking thing? And like, okay, so what's meditation? It's mindfulness, right? So those researchers suggest if you do 8 weeks of like half an hour meditation where you're just focusing on your breath and whatever, there's actually changes in the brain where the amygdala, the like emotional outrage or whatever, gets slightly smaller. Although you don't want it too small, because apparently the thing I heard the other day is like in psychopaths, they have like no amygdala, they don't feel anything. So you don't want to feel nothing, right? But I'm sure it could be a little smaller in all this. And then the hippocampus becomes bigger, so that's like memories and stuff. And there's actually a bit of extra grey matter in the frontal lobes. So there's measurable physiological changes in the brain happen from meditation, right? So that's through mindfulness, where you're trying to clear your mind and get rid of the clutter in your head and learn to focus. And I think social media, if there's such a thing as mindfulness meditation, that suggests and applies to a thing called mindlessness. And I would suggest that Facebook encourages a state of mind called mindlessness. And perhaps that makes your hippocampus smaller and your amygdala bigger as you're getting fucking outraged and all this shit. So it's like the opposite of like Vipassana meditation. It's social media. And like the other thing is, it's like, okay, why are cigarettes bad? Well, the cliche is they say that it takes 15 minutes off your life, each cigarette, right? Well, I'm using social media 2 hours a fucking day, taking off my life. And that's in the now, not at the end of my life. Do you know what I mean? So it's a vice. It's taken over. We need AA groups around Facebook and social media. And I think when if in one part of your life you give in to constant instant gratification and bad habits like pulling it out every 5 seconds, I would suggest it's harder to regulate other aspects of your life, like not drinking and not being seduced by the peer pressure when your friends are drinking, cigarettes, cannabis, other drugs, other behavior like gossiping to get that quick hit of instant gratification when you compare yourself to, but all these areas, or lying, sometimes it's easier to lie than to tell the truth in the moment. But, it's a better short-term strategy, but a worse long-term strategy. But you don't want to deal with the consequences in the now, just like the same psychology of when you take in alcohol or whatever. All these aspects of your life, I would suggest get ripped. You're more susceptible to it when you're constantly practicing mindlessness meditation on social media. And then, obviously, when it comes to ideology on top of that, it's a fucking recipe for disaster. So, Peterson's kind of draws on Nietzsche's idea of the last man and radical egalitarianism. So Nietzsche's prediction is that with the death of God, where you had the moral parables on the focus on the individual's capacity for corruption, like Buddhism, Christianity, or even Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, neo-Marxism, the individual's dead and all those moral parables are gone because obviously, the world wasn't created in 7 days or whatever the fuck, right? And that, Buddha didn't get reincarnated, right? So all that's thrown out with the bathwater, all those moral parables that maybe were the operating system to allow us to get to the point we got to so the individual's focusing on not being corrupt, right? It becomes this Marxist shit where like, oh, it's the external world, the material reality, and all that lessons of the internal world are forgotten. And so not only does the moral burden not come on the individual to focus on their element of corruption, like if Christ or Buddha is your role model, you're kind of thinking about, oh, how am I corrupt, right? But if they're not your role model and it's like Kim Kardashian, it's like, how can I be as a fucking much of a hedonistic piece of shit as I can? So that's Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the last man. So society would oscillate to the last man. So a society more interested in increasing comfort, right? So that's your Pimp My Ride, your celebrity culture, your gossip magazines, your fucking football stars, your vapid shit, right? And I would say that the reason people become totalitarianism is they realize the vapidness in that. And I would say that things like the GFC, the Iraq War, and then Australian Idol and Pimp My Ride and Kim Kardashian destroy the faith in the civilization and makes people to look to radical alternatives.
Right.
And then the other prediction was societies would go to radical egalitarianism. So instead of focusing on my capacity for corruption, I'm looking at society, I'm looking at the group identity. And so for me to feel moral, I don't need to focus on my stuff. It's all about the persona level, understanding the external world. So if I tell you not to say bad words, then I'm moral, right? And the other thing is like, how much of us are looking for an excuse to power trip, right? So in this study, I talk about, right, So I'll just tell you a bit from my show because it helps articulate this. So they did a study where people walk across a rickety bridge and they have a woman standing in the middle, right? They have that same woman standing in a bridge closer to the ground that's stable, and then they ask them to rate how attractive she is. They say that on the rickety bridge she was more attractive because the heart was racing, and then our consciousness experienced feelings, and then we attributed why we feel those feelings. So they attribute the anxiety towards her and rate her more attractive because we associate that with people we're attracted to. So that means if you're on a coffee date, you should order the coffee and be like, oh, can you put 5 shots in that coffee? That way her heart's racing. And she's like, oh my God, I haven't felt this way about anyone. This is incredible. And I need to take a shit. This is how incredible this guy is. Anyway, so the point is, if you're got an ideological narrative of like, you've said the word cunt in a bar or whatever, and I've got this ideological narrative that cunt is degrading to women, and I've got this postmodernist crap that says that everything's culture. That's the other part of the belief. Everything's culture. There's no biology. And it's a utopian fantasy to believe everything's culture, because if you believe everything's culture, human consciousness is infinitely malleable, and we can redesign human beings by changing the culture. And that's how you got the crazy Marxist collectivism where everyone was forced to work in the same farms and shit, right? Anyway, so my point was, when I have an ideological narrative, we all desire, you would agree there's pleasure in momentary domination of other people. So you say the word cunt, I feel justified in going, you sexist piece of shit, yeah. I get to feel that joy of putting you down, but then I've got a narrative to explain why I feel that joy. And that joy isn't that I'm a power-tripping piece of shit. It's now that I'm a hero. And I go, oh, this feeling of joy of shaming him, this must be what it feels like to take a baby out of a burning building. I'm a hero.
Yeah, a lot of former ideologues have spoken about that. Like, a lot of it was feeling like you were the comic book hero in real life. Like you were Superman. You know, and you could bust out and save society from this evil, despicable individual.
Totally.
How do you explain, or how would you guide someone who is maybe falling down this trope of ideology, whether it's the left or the right? What advice would you give them?
Don't be so goddamn fucking arrogant to think that, you know, all the Muslim extremists, ISIS members, the communists and past, the Nazis and all that, don't be so arrogant to think that you've stumbled across the one true religion. For God's sakes, you know, read widely, get out of your echo chamber, travel more, read more books. Stop being lazy. Because when I was an ideologue, it's not like I sat there and I read, okay, one book that's anti-capitalism, another book that's pro-capitalism, and then read 10 of those books that are the best in those field, sit there, write multiple essays, trying to deliberate in my mind what, you know, none of that happens. There's no real rigor that happens. There's no real search for the truth. It's like, oh, Gary says that, and oh, fucking sounds about right. Yeah, no, it's evil. I'm going to fucking kill everyone now. I feel justified, you know? So, like, have some goddamn humility. Like, the left has trouble eating humble pie because it's not vegan and organic. So we need to hand out humble pie in the streets. But, yeah, I would say, yeah, read about psychology, read about cults, read about ideology, listen to lectures on it. You're in the age of the internet. There's all these lectures there for free. Be aware of your own capacity to come to the group. Okay, so this is how I see group dynamics working, right? So, all right, so have you ever, like, tried to quit coffee or drinking or whatever? And then, like, you wrestle in your own mind of, like, say, you know, you're out with a mate and it's Friday. It's like, you know, you've got the weekend free and they're like, there's a voice in your head. You're like, go on, just have a drink, right? Then the other voice is like, look, no, you've had too much. Just chill out. You'll like it better tomorrow. And so there's a civil war in your head. Right? You got the alcohol lobby in your head with those neurons going, fucking do it, mate. You're out with the boys. And the other one's like, no, don't. You're going to go out with the girlfriend tomorrow. And so there's that going on. When you're hanging out in an echo chamber and all your friends have some weird belief system or whatever, it's like you have 9 other people in your fucking head against that one voice that's like caught up in the corner. Do you know what I mean? Going like, it's getting like gang kicked. So you got, not only do you have one voice in your head that disagrees with the other voice, you got 9 other voices of the people who your brain is hardwired to trust, right? And so it's like, yeah, you have 9 against 1 in your head. That's what happens. That's how you get to Jim Jones' suicide cult.
Yeah. You've spoken a lot about Jordan Peterson. How did you find him?
Well, one of the things that got me out, because we got confirmation bias, we don't like to see things that disrupt our preconceptions of reality. So I would look at I would avoid looking at social justice warrior cringe videos. And then, because I was watching like just dumb entertainment a night to soothe me, like just fail videos. And then eventually I took up the courage to look at one of these SJW videos. I was like, holy fuck. It was like a fish out of water. I could just see this. I was actually amazed at how identical the speech patterns were with the social justice warriors, the ideologues that I was involved with in Sydney, and Brisbane, to some city in America. It's like this is the Borg. These people are fucking hijacked by memes. They're just meme machines. And that was amazing. And seeing how blinded they were and seeing it from an outside point of view was cathartic. And then through that, I saw, people like Ben Shapiro and Milo Yiannopoulos, who can articulate at least clearly to some degree why some of these things aren't the full story, or maybe in some cases completely wrong. And then obviously Jordan Peterson seemed to be the most thorough and deepest of those three.
Well, he seemed to be a lot less ideological than the others out there.
Yeah, Milo seems to just,
he's on like he spits things out like he's on a machine.
He's not as deep or as authentic as the other guys. But yeah, Jordan Peterson, having studied ideology and psychology, helps to illuminate this stuff so much, and I feel has given me that message of like, if you want to be moral, you want to be a hero, you're going to do it without a fucking mob validating you, and it's going to be in the small areas of your life. So,
clean your room.
It's like Cole Yong said, no, people can't see God because they can't look low enough, right? And so it's like, instead of looking to, like, I can in my locus control, I can stop telling myself that I hate myself in my head. That could be step one. Step two could be telling my family members that I love them and show gratitude for them. That could make their life better. And that would do a hell of a lot to ripple out good in the world than fucking holding a sign screaming at someone to be the change that I can't be in my life. So that's the thing. It's like, it's actually hard to live up to your own value structure. It's so much easier to tell other people to live up to their own value structure. Like, part of the awakening for me was like, oh yeah, the government's corrupt, but then I realized I'm corrupt. Do you know what I mean? My own consciousness is like a shitty president doing crazy things. And like my subconscious is like the journalist at the White House press conference asking my conscious questions like, Mr. President, didn't you say you're going to start going to the gym? And my consciousness makes excuses and like, oh yeah, well, we are actually in a motivational recession at the moment. And as motivation increase, you know what I mean? Like we are our own parliament of fuckery and a civil war in our own head. And we got to win that battle and bring that into alignment with our own value structures and live authentically in line with our own behavior. And that requires years of hard work. And that, I think if everyone was doing that, we would be a lot closer to the actual utopia these fuckwits are thinking about. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
It's not the system, it's you.
I agree. You've experienced a lot of this stuff now. What work or what consideration have you given to starting your own, not so much organisation, but
cult?
Not a cult, but some form of work here in Australia to help?
Yep. So my consideration is I'm going to start doing a video series called The Cognitive Dissonant, where I'm going to examine these different aspects of the way our mind tricks us, whether it relates to ideology, addiction, or emotional issues, or self-esteem, or belief systems. And I'm going to be doing that, and I look forward to that. I'm also going to try to write a book while I'm doing it, and then do a tour, a live stand-up show on that topic. I'm also going to write another book about my experiences in activism. It's going to be called The Safe Space Archipelago.
Okay.
It's going to be all about my experiences in that, and hopefully it'll be entertaining, illuminating, and humorous. and I'm going to try to facilitate some debates between people on the, not quite radical end of the political spectrum, but kind of, there, try to normalize debate and try to break the echo chamber and articulate how the echo chamber is more dangerous than anything almost, And I'm going to sell shirts. I'm going to, the Antifa flag, it's like a red flag and a black flag with a circle around it that says anti-fascist action. I'm going to have a shirt that says anti-ideological thinking, and it's going to be two brains, a pink brain and a grey brain.
I've seen this, yeah. This would be really good.
And I'm going to sell a Make Yourself Great Again hat, like the red hat, so they'll make fun of the radical left and the radical right. And I'm going to try to maybe do some maybe once that's moved along, I might try and do some protest stunts where have like radical centrists doing a protest, like yelling about how they're corrupt in the street to just do a funny comedy video. I'm going to make sketches articulating these kind of issues. And
a lot.
Yeah, so I've got a lot of work that I'm enthusiastic about ahead of me, and I think I can really do a critical blow to the momentum of ideological possession, because I was in hell, man. I went through 4 years of fucking hell.
Yeah, and you've seen a lot of the sides as well.
Well, I think I've developed a bit of intuition around this, but I look forward to furthering my understanding around these subjects. And I also want to interview multiple psychologists and some people who are maybe experts on some of the particular subjects that I want to get involved to.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do podcasts and interviews with them. That's my ambition.
I think that would be awesome. We're running out of time, so I want to jump into some quick, fast questions for you. What does your morning look like? What's your morning ritual?
It's chaotic. Some nights it's laying in bed until 1 p.m. But the last few days I've been waking up and I just eat and I go to the gym. I do like half an hour of jogging and then some push-ups. I feel way better the days I do that than when I don't do that and I've like drunk and smoked pot and hung out with the comics the night before.
Yeah.
And even though it feels good in the moment, I feel when you trade self-esteem when you indulge in instant pleasure, that's you, because you lose faith in yourself. You're like, well, I'm a piece of shit, aren't I? Although it is interesting to know that people can get to such a level of denial where they just rationalize their addiction. And like, no, smoking cannabis is wonderful. You know what I mean? And I almost envy their ability, because that protects them from the self-esteem damage for having the instant gratification. But yeah, that's kind of what my morning looks like. But I hope to get into a better routine and small incremental steps.
There you go. Best purchase under $200.
Ooh, lordy. A book called You Are Now Less Dumb, all about our cognitive biases.
Okay, very nice. What seems obvious to you but not to others?
Well, I think it might be the case that we don't have free will.
Okay, so you're in that Sam Harris camp?
I think it might be the case that when people look for the sacred or spiritual things, they're looking to like an abstraction, and it might be that this is enough that this is the spiritual realm, like being now in the material is that. I think that because of convergent evolution, that like evolutionary traits evolve independently from each other. So the biggest example is like vertebrates and invertebrates. Some creatures evolve eyeballs. Creatures with spines and without spines evolve separated evolutionarily before they evolved eyes, and independently evolved that. Mm-hmm. So I think that there might be an objective state of morality and consciousness and awareness that could be realized through humanity or other species, in the same way that like maths is like prime numbers kind of exist in an abstraction, that these universal truths and moralities and tendencies might be realized independently through multiple species in the universe.
Not through the lens of just humans.
Yeah, not through the lens of, and that there's an objective state of bliss and love and compassion that the universe is trying to realize within itself, and that is something that might redeem all the suffering and horrific nature of reality.
Last question for you. If you could have a billboard anywhere in Australia, where would it be and what would it say?
It would say, "Get fucked, cunt." It would. Where would it be? Yeah, so you know the Coca-Cola sign?
Yeah.
That's on King Street or whatever? I would replace that with a Cole Young quote that says, people don't have ideas, ideas have people.
I like that. It's really good. Where can people find you? What are you up to?
They can find me in the club. No, they can... Yeah, if you go to my like page, is a good place to follow me. Shayne Hunter, Shayne Hunter. I do gigs all around the country. I'm always touring, doing shit. If you want to come see me, I put on occasional solo shows. So I'm going to be I'm doing a solo show at the moment at the Melbourne Comedy Festival until the end of the 22nd of April. That show is about addiction, the war on drugs and psychedelics. And then I'm going to Sydney in May. I'm doing the Sydney Comedy Festival with the same show for the 4th to the 6th at the Factory Theatre and Enmore. And then I'll be in Sydney after that. And then at the end of May, I'm going to do another show called The Cognitive Dissident, where I'm going to try and do comedy. I've got to write a lot of it, but I'll be trying to do a prototype version of that show to develop it. And then I'll be going to after that, I'll go to Brisbane, do the same. Then I go to a small run in Canberra and in Sydney again. And then I'll be back in Brisbane. And then I'll in July, I'll probably go to Perth and then keep touring around all the cities, doing these gigs and trying to do these shows, writing these books. So you see me. I'll probably, if you're in Australia, I'll probably come to where you are eventually.
Awesome. And it was Shayne Hunter on Facebook?
Yeah, and YouTube. I also do a YouTube thing, but I got to get my shit together and get my proper website and all that going.
It's hard when you're traveling as much as you do, man.
Yeah. You know, but it's also easy when you're substance abusing to not do it.
Look, this has been awesome. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Thank you for making it this far. Before you run off, we have a quick ask for you. Subscribe on your podcast app. Subscribing will give you priority access and help your fellow-minded listeners find Uncommon. Or you could also share with a friend. This will go a long way in building our audience, which will help us both get further guests on the show. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube by searching Neuralle, which is Neuralle. But until next time, thanks for listening.